All right. So our keynote speaker is Tamika Butler. She's a national expert and speaker on issues related to the built environment, equity, anti-racism, diversity and inclusion, organizational behavior, and change management. She is principal and founder of Tamika L. Butler Consulting, where she focuses on shining a light on inequality, inequity, and social justice. Tamika, thanks so much for being here. You can go ahead if you're ready.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for being patient with my technological differences. Uh, happy to be here, and we'll still get us in on time. So I want to talk a little bit about transportation, mobility, and social equity. Let's see. It looks like you guys are seeing the notes.
Yep, it looks like.
Let me try again. Hopefully it'll work this time. Technology always wins, I say. Okay. Did that work?
Yep, there we go.
Perfect. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about transportation and social equity. I always like to start my talks by acknowledging that we are on Indigenous land, and I always encourage people to do the same. There are a ton of ways you can find out whose land you're inhabiting. I'm going to share a resource in the chat, and what I really encourage people to do is not just these land acknowledgements, but also to really think about the authentic relationships and informed action you can take with Indigenous communities. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. The other thing I like to start with is just a little bit of a self check-in. Just, how are people doing? How are people feeling? And I think an easy way that I like to do that is by sharing the blob tree, one of my favorite things that I like to use. And I like to just encourage people just silently to yourself, pick a blob from the tree that best describes how you are feeling coming into this session, into this whole day you're about to have, and really, really think about why that's the blob person that represents you, and ask yourself, despite how you might be feeling, or because of how you might be feeling, how can you be fully present? How can you really plug into the things you're going to hear, the things you're going to experience, and the things folks are going to talk about? And how can you make sure that you are being completely present? I share this and I say that today I'm feeling like blob person number 5 that's laying down there on the floor. And so, before I even had my technical difficulties, I wanted to acknowledge that I might not be at my best today. I'm a Black person in this country, and there's a lot happening. I'm a mother of a Black boy, and knowing that air fresheners or expired tags or whatever it could be could lead to his untimely death. Knowing that I do transportation and transit work, and whether or not we're talking about Oscar Grant many years ago taking the train in the Bay Area, whether or not we're talking about brother Ahmad running in his own neighborhood, we know as Black folks that these things weigh on us. And again, as a mother particularly, and a mother of a 2-year-old Black boy, but of a daughter who's only 3 weeks old and did not sleep at all last night, I really am struggling with how tough it is. And my wife and I were talking about this, my wife who's white, and I was saying, I don't know what it is for white folks, but you're just able to keep going. This is all consuming. This is all I think about. Doom scrolling and trying to avoid videos. So I just want to acknowledge that wherever you are on this blob tree, and for whatever reason you might be there, I appreciate that you're spending a little bit of time with me today, and hope that we can all find ways to be present and to take care of one another. With that being said, I want to tell you a little bit about who I am. I hold many identities, but perhaps the most important identity to me is as a Midwesterner. I am from the great neighboring state of Nebraska, where we celebrate the good life. And a lot of folks don't know much about Nebraska. Since I'm here on the West Coast, whenever I do these talks, people ask me to explain about Nebraska, and I tell them about corn, but I've been very excited that in recent months, I've been able to talk about the fact that we are a place where people might go to the airport when it's really cold, and we're a place where our vote really matters. It's not like we have an important caucus, but we have this small little district, and this is a district where most of my family lives and votes, except my sister, who has moved to Iowa. And when I left Nebraska, I left because I thought I'm too Black, I'm too gay, I gotta get out of the Midwest. And so I went to Stanford to go to law school. Um, I quickly realized, being in California, that I was quite Midwestern, and I really appreciated that. But I also appreciated the experience I got. After law school, I decided I wanted to be an employment lawyer. And so I went to the historically Black communities of San Francisco, and I started a one-stop workers' rights clinic. So anybody could come in and ask me their questions. And what I quickly realized in one of the neighborhoods, Bayview Hunters Points, is that no one wanted to talk to me about their employment discrimination issues until they knew where I was on transit. And so the community I was in, Bayview Hunters Point, if you don't know about Bayview Hunters Point, it is where the San Francisco 49ers used to play at Candlestick Park. Bayview Hunters Point is a predominantly, or was at the time, a predominantly Black neighborhood that was geographically isolated from the core of the city. And the city decided, SFMTA decided that they were going to start a new Muni line, the T line, that would go to Bayview Hunters Point. And when they decided to go to Bayview Hunters Point, the people weren't happy. They felt like this wasn't a train line for them. They felt like no one had asked them about stops or frequency. All they had going to Bayview Hunters Point were buses, and those buses were not reliable. They didn't always come, and when they did come, they weren't always on time. And so everyone saw the promise in this train line, but then people felt like it was just to bring people in, take them to football games, and take them out. They didn't have opportunities to work on the line for jobs. And whenever I would talk to people, this is what they wanted to talk about. And it was the first job I had where I really started to understand the way that transportation is the prism through which we should be seeing all of our social justice issues. Whether or not these folks were talking about getting to quality education, talking about jobs, it became very clear that we can't talk about economic mobility without talking about mobility. We can't talk about access to education or healthcare or even vaccines without talking about how people get there. And so this is really when I fell in love with transportation. I was lucky enough to then become the executive director of the LA Bicycle Coalition. I'm starting a PhD in urban planning focused on transportation in the fall at UCLA. And so it's something that I really love. In my personal life, I'm on the board of organizations like Transit Center, and transportation is a big part for me of social justice. And so I think sometimes when people think about equity or social justice or fighting racism, they think about, prison reform or education reform. No one wakes up and says, you care about racial justice, you should become a planner. You should become someone who's interested in transportation. But it's actually key to all of the issues. And that's why for my job, I've actually started my own consulting company. My previous job was at another big private consulting company where I was the director of California planning and the director of equity and inclusion for all 20 of our offices in Canada and the United States. And ultimately last summer, I decided to do my own business. And so what do I do in my business? I have a number of clients. I do anything from working with counties to working with national organizations. I would say that about 50% of my clients are transportation related, with the other clients, maybe 40% being around, just random things, nonprofits, museums, folks who are really trying to integrate equity and change management into their everyday practices. And then that last percent is really about climate change and sustainability projects. And this is a project I work on with the LA County Sustainability Office. The other thing I do is write a lot. I was lucky enough to be featured on the cover of Bicycling magazine. I was the guest editor for this magazine. And so I do a lot of writing. I do a lot of community engagements. This was a community engagement opportunity with Spin, the scooters that were trying to be more equitable. And then just like this, I do a lot of public speaking and working with nonprofits who are trying to put together policy briefs about how to approach these issues differently. That's enough about me. I would love to talk about transit. Whenever I talk about transit, I just try to run people through the things that I think those of us speaking to the choir that we all know, that transit is a good thing, that when we're talking about transportation, when we're talking about public transportation, we can create jobs, we can help the environment. It's something that this administration is talking a ton about, but we saw so many cuts during the pandemic that it's an important reminder that whether or not you're talking about people with disabilities or whether or not you're just talking about everyone, when public transportation is done well, it can be life-changing. It can be a win-win for everyone involved. And especially as around the country, we are seeing this rebirth of people. We definitely were before the pandemic. We saw ridership dropping in a lot of places, but we also saw a rebirth of people discovering that quality public transportation could suit their needs. Now, it has to be quality and it has to go to the places and people, you know, it has to be able to get people to the places and people and things and resources that they need. But we have to remember that transportation is critical. And again, this is especially important as we're turning a corner in this pandemic, perhaps seeing a light at the end of a tunnel, that transportation is key. Too often we think of transportation as something that's just there, that we could just rely on, but we all know when it goes bad, we all notice. And so this has to be something we can invest in. And we can always look overseas to see how other people do it. Paris is a great example that they made it a little bit more difficult to get around by bike. I have a friend the other day who said I was going to take the bus to work because he still had to go into the office. And he said that he missed it barely and he would have had to wait an hour for the next bus. So he got in his car. And as long as we make it hard for people to get around by public transportation and easier to get around by car, we're never going to see progress. But all of this, of course, has to be based in talking about race. And that's what really matters. So why does it matter? Why do I always want to talk about race? Well, whenever I talk about race and transportation, I usually get someone looking at me like this, wondering what happened to old Kanye? What happened to Kanye's marriage? What happened to Kanye's presidential run? Somebody that's just scratching their head saying, why, when we're talking about transportation or public space or land use, why are we always talking about race, Tamika? Why do you always have to make everything about race? And what I try to explain to people is that for some of us in this society, our race has always been used to tell us how we should navigate public space, right? It's always been used to tell us exactly where we can and can't go. It's always been this feature where some of us feel like we're on the outside looking in, wondering why some people have access to things like reliable transportation, green space parks, but we don't, why we can't reach those things. I talked earlier about doing more than just land acknowledgements, but actually understanding that we have to talk about race when we talk about transportation and land use, because it is built into the very fabric of our country, a country that was founded on exploiting the free labor of folks of color and stealing land. This is a book that Hitler once referred to as a Bible to him because of the way it talks about people of color diluting the human race. This is also an author who many people refer to as one of the forefathers of our park system, one of the people who really helped conceptualize it. But when we're trying to do equity work in the present, if we can't acknowledge the past, then sometimes we don't understand those links. We don't understand that even today, if you look at our national park system, a system that was founded on stealing land, putting up fences, and charging fees for people to use land that didn't even really belong to us. And you look at the demographics today, and you see that it's still folks of color and low-income folks who use public parks and national parks at a lower rate than white affluent people. Because something that is started in a racist foundation often continues and perpetuates. Many of us who live in this country know that when we look at maps, whether or not these lines are drawn, this is what people see. That some neighborhoods are okay for speculation, some neighborhoods are okay to live in, and some neighborhoods you shouldn't even think about. We have to grow up in communities where we know that laws, land use policies allow certain things to happen in our neighborhoods that would never happen in other neighborhoods. And often we like to say, well, this is about, you know, income. It's this happens to poor people. It's not just about race. And I always like to explain to folks that I live in a very affluent Black neighborhood, a Black neighborhood that is always on TV shows when they're showing LA fancy neighborhoods, a Black neighborhood where celebrities like Ray Charles built their mansions. And this is also the neighborhood where, for my friend who grew up in Los Angeles, said all of her friends who grew up in this neighborhood have had miscarriages, bloody noses, asthma, because it is adjacent to the largest active oil drilling site in the United States, urban active drilling site in the United States. And it's not because people here are poor, it's because they're Black. And over the weekend, we know there was controversy when Secretary Pete said that highways have racism built into them. And some people said highways aren't racist. But the reality is, any of us who do this work know that highways are some of the biggest perpetuators of racism and white supremacy, and also of income inequality. We know that when you're driving, there are certain places where it's like next 7 exits, this place. And there are other places where if you miss your one exit, you're out of luck. You got to get off, you got to cut back. Anybody who really studies the history of transportation knows that whenever highways were built, certain communities were raised, displaced, pushed out. And that continues today. Again, just using my local context, South LA, which is a predominantly Black and Latinx neighborhood, versus West LA, which is where Beverly Hills is, Westward, UCLA. We know that there are certain communities where it is easier to get fast food than fresh food, where it is easier to go to a liquor store than a grocery store. And so for many of us who do transportation work, we might show up at a meeting and we're just there to talk about a new bus line or a change in schedule or a new project. And people keep bringing up things like food insecurity or housing costs or worrying about different things. And what we have to start realizing, whether or not you're talking about an urban setting, a rural setting, whether or not you're talking about, a big city or a small town, when we go to these meetings and we're doing our work, we have to realize that for the people we serve, we might be there to talk about one subject, but they don't lead single issue lives. All of these things bleed together for them. And so they have to bleed together for us. We have to start thinking about intersectionality, a term coined by a Black female lawyer. And it's about the fact that as people, even if you're not a person of color, all of us as people, we have many different identities, many different things that make us who we are. And all of those things come together to make our experiences unique, whether or not we're riding on a bus, walking down a street, sitting in a classroom, or sitting on a Zoom. Intersectionality also holds true when we're talking about different issue areas, housing and transportation and climate. Those things come together. And we have to be able to think about the intersections when we do our work. I always tell transportation folks that if a client hires me and says people keep dying at this intersection, I can't go out to the intersection and say, oh my gosh, it's a mess. We have to change signal timing and lane width, and we have to extend the curb. And I can't say this seems like too much. I know people are dying and I know this is what you hired me to do, client, but I'm gonna go mid-block and I'm gonna create a parklet. That'll solve your problem, right? I can't just go mid-block because it's easier. Intersections are where the action is, and we have to be able to look at our work intersectionally because we have to realize that there are many people who feel like their neighborhoods are simply killing them. And if any of this feels new to you, oftentimes I get this look. What's happening? Right? Why are we talking about this? And what I encourage people to do, I've already said I'm on the board of Transit Center, and Transit Center put out this report last year where they looked at what's really going on, right? We know ridership numbers are dropping, and so how can we win people back? They said first, we have to look at 4 very important things: housing costs, how housing costs are causing displacement. Number 3, the changing demographics of community. Is housing costs go up and people are displaced, what are the demographics that are changing from communities? And race. Those are the things that we have to look at when we're talking about transportation. And we also have to look at the fact that the people doing the work, right? Who's riding transit versus who's working? Transportation and transit agencies are huge employers wherever they are, but we know that the demographics of their employees don't match that of the riders. We know that when you look at the census, a majority of transit riders are women, people of color, and people with low income. But when you look at boardrooms of transit agencies, when you look at those in decision-making positions, there's not a match. Women only comprise 39% of the transit agency workforce. Less than 5 transit agency CEOs are women. And we know when we look at the boards, it just gets worse. They're predominantly white, and only 2 CEOs of the major large agencies are folks of color, right? And so we have to start asking ourselves, is transportation and transit in particular, is it a white space? We have to be willing to talk about race. And we have to understand what it's like for our colleagues who are in this work, who are young and Black and gifted, are young and gifted and have a disability, are LGBTQ, are women. What is it like for folks who are gifted and who want to do this work, but are different than that majority we've seen? And I'll talk in particular about Black folks because I'm Black. The Harvard Business Review did an issue in 2019, last fall, about how tough it is for Black leaders to advance, no matter the industry. They talked about the way that Black folks, and you'll see I've sprinkled in a few resources you could go back to later. They've talked about the way that Black folks have to figure out the ways of white folks. They have to figure out code switching. Code switching is seen as crucial for professional advancement, but it comes at a huge psychological cost. When people ask what code switching is, I remind them to think about that video of former President Obama going into a basketball locker room. He greets the white coach and he shakes his hand and he says, "How are you doing?" And then he goes to a Black coach and he daps him up, gives him a hug, and it's just instinctual, right? We know that there are folks who have to go in and out of how they interact with different people, how we talk, how we dress, the way we do our hair. And some people might say, well, that's just professionalism. We all have to give up a little bit of ourselves. But we have to ask ourselves, who's gotten to define what is professional? And what are the roots of that professionalism? We say it's professional to be on time. In many professions, we have a time clock where people clock in and clock out. But how often do we realize that that's a practice that started on plantations with slaves having to be on the field for a certain time and clock in and clock out? So many things we think are professional actually require certain groups of folks to code switch, right? And many organizations are still segregated. Many organizations still stay really white at the top. But then when you look at the frontline staff, the drivers, the janitorial staff, then it's people of color. And we can't just think of these things as one off. We have to really ask ourselves, why is it that for staff of color, or staff with disabilities, or women to feel like they can succeed, they have to be invisible. There is a whiteness problem in transportation, and it's not because of bad intent. I actually think and love transportation because most of us who do this work care deeply. We're good people who want to connect other people. But the reality is, we often engage in planning and transportation and policy and design practices that center whiteness. We think that we're planning in a way that includes the basic perspectives and experiences of all people, when in reality, we're planning based on experiences of place and space that are only afforded to those who experience those places and spaces as able-bodied people, as white people, as people who have a certain level of privilege, right? A great example of this is when the pandemic first started, many places started these slow streets programs. Slow streets were this idea that if we can close down streets to traffic, when people are stuck inside, they can get outside and they can use one of our most valuable resources, streets, for playing, for walking, for biking, for scooting, right? For rolling, right? All of these things. And there were many advocates of color who said, I'm not sure about slow streets. And when people said, well, why aren't you sure about slow streets? No one wanted to acknowledge that a man had just been shot running down his street, that a young man was walking in his neighborhood one night just carrying Skittles and lost his life. If we don't start thinking about the fact that even though our intentions are pure and good, everyone might not experience space in the same way, then we're never going to do this work successfully. We have to understand that we have to start doing engagement, not just outreach. Too often, we like to go into communities and say, here's what we plan to do. What do you think? Here are some stickers. Here are some dots. You can put them here or here, and we'll tell you what we're going to do. True engagement is really building off of cultural strengths and values that are already in the community. Yes, it's about being culturally competent, but it's also about being culturally specific. What do I mean by culturally specific? Think about the old school food pyramid. When public health officials used to go around and say, you have to eat so many meals, have to come from this square and this square and this square. But if you go into certain communities, think about an immigrant community. They might look at that food pyramid and say, none of my native foods are in that pyramid. We have vegetables where I'm from, we have fruits where I'm from, but they're not pictured here. Does that mean I can't be healthy? So we have to start looking to local leadership and really participating in research with them authentically. And we have to understand that true engagement means that we may come in with an idea, but the outcome may be different. We may come in and say, I used to work at a bike coalition. We want to put a bike lane here. And people may say, well, I don't want a bike lane. We just can't throw up our hands and say, oh, poor low income people or people of color don't want a bike. We have to say why. And they have to say, well, I don't know. And then we just keep going back and forth. And after a series of engaging conversations, we may actually learn that even if the bike lane is there, they don't want to use it because they think traffic is too fast. And so even though we fixed the street by putting in a bike lane, if the speed of traffic is too fast and people don't want to use it, we would only learn that through true engagement. We also have to think about partnerships. We have to realize that if the question is all partnership equal? It's not. The reality is that no community partnerships is no longer a way that can work. We can't just make changes to our systems, to our transportation delivery and not talk to community members. But we also have to look within and realize that within departments and agencies and consulting teams, whatever it is, we have to work together. We can't just have strong community partnerships, but weak coordination behind the scene. We can't ask community partners to show up to 5 different meetings when we could have handled it all in one. And when we work with community members, we have to realize that we have to define and commit to equity like yesterday. Why do we have to define equity? Because equity is like the color blue. We all like to say equity, 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 but some of us are talking about light blue, some of us are talking about sky blue, some of us are talking about navy. We have to come up with a definition that works for our partnerships, for our agencies. We have to understand the pressure points. We know that transportation is a great line of work because it can cross political lines. But we also know that transportation is very political. There's a lot of people that can say no to a project and shut it down for political reasons. So what are those pressure points? We have to identify them up front. We can't wait for a crisis or a pandemic or the death of another person to solve problems through partnership. We have to create these partnerships early and often. We have to have capacity conversations, know what people can provide. And then we have to start paying community members like the experts that they are. I get paid a ton as a consultant, but do I know more than the grandmother who's looking out her window every day and can tell you everything about the speed of a street, can tell you everything about this bus route? Do I know more than the young kids hanging out on the corner or sitting on their steps? We have to start trusting community members. And to do that, we have to understand power. Power isn't just something we wield like a sword. Power is something that we have to realize beyond just being over people, it's something we can have with people. There's already power in people and communities that we want to serve. So, how do we stop thinking about colonial systems of empowering, saying we're showing up as the professionals, we're the only one with power, and we're bestowing it upon you? And how do we start saying there's already power here? We want to work with you, we want to co power you. The reality is, this is a picture that many people have seen, right? And it's helpful because it helps us realize that equality and equity aren't the same thing. That for true equity, you give people what they need. And sometimes that means some people don't get something, but they'll still be okay. That's not an accurate picture. I hate that picture because it doesn't show the reality and it doesn't show where we should be trying to get. When we talk about mobility and transportation, and we talk about where we should be trying to get, I'm thinking about liberation. I do this work because, again, I want people to be able to move freely to the places and people and resources and things that they want to get to. And I want them to be able to do it with dignity. And that's what true liberation looks like. But even this picture lacks that understanding of power. Someone still said, what these folks want is to watch baseball. And look, I don't live in Nebraska anymore. I live in LA, and the LA Dodgers are World Series champions. So I love baseball right now. But what if you don't like baseball? What if you don't want to just watch the game? What if you want to play in the game? What if you want to be the umpire? What if you want to coach the team? What if you want to own the team? What if baseball's not your thing, but you're a budding entrepreneur and you want to have an exclusive contract with Major League Baseball to sell peanuts at every stadium? At some point, we have to realize that even though we may come in and say, we're here to do transportation or transit work, we have to listen to people and ask what they want, let them self-determine, and figure out a place we can meet in the middle. And I'll end by saying, if we truly want to make institutional change, we have to think about how we create brave spaces. Often people are afraid to talk about race or racism, or social justice or equity, because they want to feel safe, they want to feel comfortable. But as a Black person in this country, as I started off with, I don't know that I ever feel safe. If you're transgender and you use the bathroom that fits your gender identity, you might not feel safe. If you're undocumented and you're going to work, even though you know ICE is doing raids, you might not feel safe. If you're a woman and you're walking and you know that you're going to get catcalled at any moment, you might not feel safe. There are so many of us that to be our authentic selves, to do our jobs, to be the only one in a room, we have to be brave. So if you're a person with privilege, and I certainly have my privileges, if you're a person with privilege, ask yourself as you do your work, how can you be brave? How can you force yourself to not be so afraid of saying the wrong thing that you say nothing at all? How can you force yourself to know that you're going to make mistakes? And that's okay. But you're not going to let your fear of making mistakes or the fact that you've made a mistake stop you from atoning, acknowledging, and continuing to move forward. After you create these brave spaces in our agencies, in our friend groups, in our communities, then you have to understand the role that power plays. How do you understand the role that power plays? A simple exercise you can always do when you're thinking about a new decision, a new program, a new policy, ask yourself who's going to be the most impacted? And I didn't say benefited. Who's going to be the most impacted? Who's both going to be positively and negative impacted? Who stands to gain or lose the most by this thing we're trying to do? And then once you determine that, look around at your decision making group. And are those folks part of that decision making group? And if they're not, then you have a power imbalance. And if you have that power imbalance, you have to analyze and challenge the privilege inherent for who got to be part of that group, who's in that room, who's at that decision making table, whose data do you trust, whose voice do you trust, who are you paying to do this work? And once we do those things, we can truly, truly start to make equity actionable in our transit work. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamika. That was great. So we'll go ahead and open it to questions. If anybody has questions, you can raise your hand or put it in the chat. Lots of compliments in the chat. Tamika, so I have a question. What role does transportation play in getting the Black community vaccinated?
Transportation plays a huge role. There have been a number of reports from big cities like LA and Houston to smaller areas where what we're realizing is that people just can't access the vaccinations. As we know, when this all started, there were a lot of places where folks would kind of go to pharmacies or go to clinics and wait until the end of the day and hope that they could get some of the leftover vaccination. And there were a lot of conversations early on about, well, why are people like, if I had a chance to get a vaccination appointment, I wouldn't miss it. And what people didn't realize is that many of the places, especially when communities were doing those mass vaccination sites, many of those places were only accessible by car. And so if you don't have a car and you don't have access to a car, then you're going to miss your appointment. And so I think we have to realize that whenever we're talking about public health, transportation is a huge part of that. And this isn't new with COVID-19. Back during the AIDS pandemic, there were a number of studies done around the stigma of AIDS and why people weren't getting the treatment that they should get for their AIDS and HIV. And many people thought it was mainly about the stigma, and that was a huge part of it. But what a number of studies found is one of the top reasons people weren't getting their treatment is because of lack of access to transportation. And so transportation and public health have always been tied. No matter the health issue, if people don't have access to quality, affordable, and reliable transportation to get to their health services, then we know people won't use them.
All right. Looks like we have some questions in the chat here.
Great. So the biggest challenge in trying to change planning transit in communities and what's most beneficial to get over those barriers? That's a great question. I think the biggest challenge sometimes is that transportation has lacked a little bit of sexiness, frankly. I think part of what's happening with Secretary Pete just being more visible and more vocal, transportation is something a lot of folks take for granted. And whether or not you look at the deterioration of our roadways or the lack of investment in public transportation, I think folks have seen transportation as something that will always be there. And so it's not necessarily something that we've invested in. It's not necessarily something that we've always made a priority and that we've always talked about. I think what's been most beneficial to getting over those barriers is having an ability to talk about the way that transportation intersects with other things. So if everybody's talking about COVID-19, you know, one of my consulting gigs was headhunting for one of our newly elected officials. And something that we talked to their potential transportation deputies about is your boss has a big important job. And there's a lot happening in the world right now that many people would say is not related to transportation. So how are you going to make sure as transportation deputy, they're still thinking about the issues that you're being hired to make sure they think about? And, you know, the best candidates all said, well, because if they're talking about COVID-19, people have to get to vaccinations. If they're talking about opening schools back up, we have to talk about how people are going to get back to schools. If we're talking about people going back to work and going back into the office, if we're talking about climate change, right? And so I think one of the most beneficial ways to help make transportation just more tangible and more real for people is to figure out ways to talk about it based on the other things that matter in their life. And the last thing I'll say on that is I think the other thing we have to think about is this word essential. During the pandemic, essential was a term that came up a lot. And too often, public transportation hasn't been viewed as essential as it should. But the reality is we saw that a lot of those essential workers were dependent on public transportation. And so if those workers are essential, if we're all depending on them and they're depending on transit, then transit is essential to all of us. And I think that's the other thing we have to help people start to realize. And I think that's how you break down one of those barriers. You may have a car, you may think you never use public transportation. But if the people you're depending on, the teachers at your kids' schools, the folks who are checking us out at the grocery store, your mail person, if all of these people are depending on transit and we're depending on them, then we're all transit dependent and we have to invest in it.
Great. All right, this one's from Julia. In more rural areas, where and how does transit start the conversation with partners? Because many rural areas don't feel inclusion and diversity is an issue.
Absolutely. I think this is something I hear a lot, especially with my Midwest clients, and especially with the fact that I'm from where I'm from. And I think this is a huge reason that when people hire me and say, we want you to put together an equity toolkit for us, what I always like to tell people is there's no, pull out my briefcase, open it up and give you my cookie cutter checklist of things to do, because it's so different from community to community. And you have to realize that when you do go to certain communities, and whether or not that is a predominantly community of color or predominantly white community, sometimes communities are so isolated that if we just come in saying, let's talk about racial equity and social justice, that's not terminology that they necessarily use. And so in order to reach these more rural areas and start the conversation about transit, I think you again have to go in and realize that the first step in any equity checklist should be asking people what's important to them, asking people what they need. And part of this is like, it's a long game, and it's really tough to make something like transportation a long game because so much of our work is tied to funding that has very specific timelines and very specific checklists of steps we have to take. And that's why on that slide about partnership, I talked about forming those partnerships long before. I was working in a community where they didn't really think transit was that big of an issue. So I was showing up at these community meetings for months, almost a year, where I was listening to us talk about things that people might have thought was not the best use of my time. But what that helped is when transportation finally came up, and I said, well, here's what I think about it. People trusted me because it didn't feel opportunistic. It didn't feel like I just started showing up to this community now that I wanted to get some transportation project done. It felt like I had made an investment in the community. I had made friends. I had made, talked about their kids, talked about the things that were important to them outside of transportation. And so when transportation came up, it was easy for me to speak up because people already trusted me. I could talk, I can contribute. And because I had been present for so long, I could also tie this specific project back to the many issues that this rural community had talked about that they didn't think was really related to transportation. And so I think an important part of starting the conversation is just being present and just being there and knowing that you don't want to seem opportunistic.
All right. Kara says, really amazing presentation. Do you have any example of transit agencies or other transportation organizations doing groundbreaking things and overcoming equity challenges?
Yeah. So I think when I think about the East Coast, there is a transportation director in Charleston, South Carolina, Keith Benjamin, and something he did, and again, maybe not as sexy, but one of the first things he did when he got his post is he changed some of the procurement methods. He kind of cleared the bench and changed some of the procurement methods so that it was easier for smaller businesses, for minority-led businesses to actually contract with the department. And so sometimes I think when we're doing equity work, we want these big splashy, like, what did we do? Can we write a press release? Can we do a groundbreaking? But I have a friend who works at the Department of Public Health here in Los Angeles. And when we were doing a training for the Department of Public Health, a number of her staff were chiming in the chat and saying, like, it just feels like we're never going to make progress. Like, LA County is huge. The Department of Public Health is huge. This crisis is huge. How do we make an impact? And something she said is, when you have a government job, when you have an agency job or a department job, you have to realize that the victories are few and far between, but when you get them, they are long lasting. And so Keith Benjamin, by changing this procurement structure, it might not be the sexiest thing that gets a press release, but even after he leaves, the communities who are going to be able to get these contracts, and part of the change was to make it easier for community-based organizations and actual community members to be paid, that change will be long-lasting. Another good example is in Oakland. They were one of the first cities to do the Slow Streets program, and they got a lot of great press for it. Podcast in the New York Times. You mentioned it. They were mentioned as like kind of the trailblazers in slow streets. And then there were a lot of people in their low income neighborhoods and their communities of color who said, we hate slow streets. You're closing down our streets to traffic. You're telling us we can't park on the street anymore, but we still work. We're still going to work every day. And so we need to be able to drive on our street. We need to be able to park on our street. Like, we're still going to work. And so what the department did is say, okay, slow streets may work in these communities over here. So we're not going to throw out the program completely. We're going to keep it here. But what do you need in your community? And when they went to some of these communities, the first project they did, they changed the title from Slow Streets to Slow Streets Essential Places. There was a community that said the only place we're getting toilet paper and cleaning supplies and all of these things you need during a pandemic is this corner liquor store. That's our community's grocery store. But people get hit every day trying to cross the street, so there's no crosswalk. So if you can rapidly implement closing a street, why can't you rapidly implement providing us a crosswalk? And they did. They put together cones at first, and then they went out and did some street painting, and they saw the number of serious injuries go down drastically because that was a main place people were trying to get. And then on top of that, they then went online and published all their data, started doing regular surveys. They started paying community-based organizations to talk to their members in their communities and ask what transportation needs they had during the pandemic. And some communities said, we want more slow streets. And some communities said, we want other things. And so they both changed their program a little bit, but then they also added this layer of public transparency so that the engagement felt real and authentic, and so they could be held accountable.
Andrea wants to know if you have a dissertation topic in mind for your future doctoral.
I had to write about one to get in, but it's still ever evolving and ever changing because my background is as a lawyer. I do want to look at land use policies and laws and property laws, and think about how laws have been used in transportation Charles Brown at Rutgers coined this term arrest mobility, to arrest the mobility of certain groups of people. So how have we used law and zoning, land use provisions to arrest the mobility of people with disabilities, people of color, women, low income people? And I'm sure I will have to narrow that down, but that's the big picture.
Melissa says, you talked about the importance of engagement rather than simply doing outreach in a community. In your work, what transportation systems or programs do you believe are doing inclusive engagement well? Interested in learning about models for best practices.
Yeah, so there's an organization started by Dr. Destiny Thomas called the Thrive-Ins Group. And the Thrive-Ins Group has just started a curriculum, the Dignity Institute, and they go through, I think, an 8-week training program about ways to do inclusive engagement. And part of what they do is kind of look at other places that are doing inclusive engagement. And so I think that, and they call it dignity infused engagement. And so Thrive-Ins Group and Dignity Institute, I think, is a good place to start. And then I think there are a lot of agencies across the country that are just talking to people more, literally talking to people more. And I think that's a huge help. I think a lot of the most inspiring work is actually sometimes coming from smaller places. So when I mentioned Charleston, South Carolina, there has been some great stuff in Indianapolis. There's some great stuff happening in the Midwest. And sometimes I think it's because smaller places, it is easier to effectuate change. You're dealing with a smaller geography. I think people typically just know each other better, are more likely to work together. And I think talking to people, though it seems simple, is huge. There's this example here in LA when we started Vision Zero. The Department of Transportation saw that there was this community, this Latinx community, low-income community, where people kept dying at this intersection. It was one of the most deadly intersections in our city. And so they sent all their engineers and planners out, and they completely reconfigured the intersection. And then they watched and they waited, and people kept dying. And they couldn't figure out why. Only then did they go out and did they talk to people in the community. And when they talked to people in the community, what they realized is there was a bus stop on that block, and that the block had a lot of older adults in it. And there was no shade shelter at the bus stop because, as we know, many low-income communities, communities of color, don't have shade shelters. And there was a tree on the other side of the street. So people would stand on the other side of the street to get shade. And when they would see the bus coming, they would try to run across the street. It was dangerous and people would get hit and people would get killed. And so even though the department changed the intersection, that was never going to work because that wasn't the actual issue. And so I think when you see communities or agencies that are doing good work, it's literally just communities and agencies that are starting to talk to people and do that as a first step. And what they realize is often it could probably also save money, save resources, and that's really important. And then the other thing I would say, just to end on this question, I think we're seeing a change at the federal level. The federal level is really, really starting to talk more about equitable engagement and equity generally. You're seeing them shut down a highway expansion in Houston, Harris County, saying that it's because of racism. And you know, these are values and these are things that people are talking about in interviews, and that's all well-meaning. But I think for those of us who do this work, we also have to understand that when you have an administration that is talking this much about equity, the dollars are also going to start to flow that way. And so I think it's also important to start to watch the federal government because they are releasing some new funding measures and they are deeply tied to how you do engagement and equity work.
All right. Well, I think that's all the time we have for this session. I just wanted to thank you. I think that was great. It was, definitely eye-opening for a lot of us, I'm sure. Provided a lot of great tips for moving forward and how to go from here. So thank you.
And thanks again for your patience. Really sorry about that.
No problem at all.
All right. Take care, folks.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye.